Hi, I'm Chris Ketzley, Executive Director here at the Association of Towns. Talk of the Towns podcast is a production of the New York State Association of Towns and strives to bring the voices from across New York to talk about all things towns. If you're interested in participating as a guest, please email us at info@nytowns.org. The views and opinions expressed by podcast guests are of their own and do not necessarily reflect the views, positions, or policies of the New York State Association of Towns. Good afternoon. Welcome back to another edition of Talk of the Towns, where we talk about all things that are important to our towns. And really, land use is one of the most important issues that our towns face. And we see that in a variety of different areas, housing and certainly renewable energies. And a couple weeks ago or so, we had a guest on to talk about BESS, battery energy storage systems. We definitely hear a lot from our members about those, and there's a lot talk about that going on in the towns now, and particularly how it relates to land use. And we have a guest with us here today to talk about it a little bit further, because this is a topic that is worthy of hearing different perspectives, different ideas, and actually continuing that conversation. So I think you're going to enjoy this today. Before we get into introducing our guests, I do want to remind you that we are on Spotify, we're on Apple platform, and we are on YouTube. So you can listen or watch on any of those platforms. But when you do, we ask that you hit like, subscribe, and share. Those help us in our rankings. Like, subscribe, and share. The last couple podcasts have been getting higher traction, so we like to see that. So make sure you keep sharing it around and help people understand and learn about all things that are important to towns. So today we have a great guest with us. Marguerite and I go way back. I think I first started 2 years ago or so. We might have been on a panel together. I think I was on a panel over there at ACE New York. And so I want to welcome to the podcast Marguerite Wells. She's the executive director at ACE New York. Welcome, Marguerite.
Thank you so much for having me, Chris.
Our pleasure. So first of all, let's start with letting everyone learn a little bit about yourself, of course, but also a little bit about what ACE New York is.
Sure, thanks. So as for myself, I'm a fifth generation New Yorker. I've been a farmer most of my life, and I got into the energy business backwards because I was running my farm business, and a neighbor said, "Hey, we should have a wind farm in our town." And I said, "Yes, we should." And he said, "And you're going to help me do it." And it just kind of rolled on from there. That was almost 20 years ago. And so now I run ACE New York, which is a nonprofit, and we advocate for clean energy all across the state. Everything from large-scale renewables to electric vehicles, building energy efficiency, and everything in between.
Say that again. How long have you been?
I've been at ACE 2 years now, so I think you and I started our respective roles about the same week.
We're classmates.
We are classmates. Yes, indeed.
And we both survived so far, so that's good.
So far, so good.
That is. So, you know, we've talked about this in the past. We've had different conversations in different places about this, but it certainly is an issue that is impacting towns, and it's a big issue, right? And so there's this land use portion to it, which is obviously our association's biggest interest. But we're seeing more and more conversation around this, because I think we're seeing more of these facilities, these storage facilities being proposed. Why is there an increase in demand all of a sudden for these battery storage facilities?
There's kind of two parts to why we are seeing a lot more storage get built. One of it is storage helps sort of buffer out the highs and lows of more renewable energy on the grid. I think that's something that's easy to sort of conceptualize, because we all know that solar and wind are not the same all the time. So the battery storage essentially acts as a shock absorber. But also, even outside of renewable energy, we are demanding so much more of our grid these days. Most of the grid was built out 80 and 100 years ago, when we had a whole lot lower expectation of how reliable electricity had to be and the quality of that electricity. And by that, I mean, brownouts and things like that. 100 years ago, if the only electric use you had was a couple light bulbs in your barn to help your dairy, run better and keep your milk cold, then a little bit of fluctuation wasn't really a big deal. And that was kind of the full expectation of electricity back when this grid that we now live with was built. And now we expect much, much higher reliability. And we have a whole lot more lives riding on whether or not it's working properly. Because, a lot of folks have home, health equipment that's got to run or they're not going to stay alive. And all of a sudden, perfection is a much more important thing to everybody. And we have a lot more electric stuff. I mean, never mind EVs, the number of electronics just lying around everybody's house was inconceivable even 50 years ago. And so the batteries help by, in different use cases, they basically allow us to defer having to upgrade the grid with bigger wires and bigger chunks of steel. Basically, the batteries can help be a shock absorber on the downstream side of the grid as well. So it saves us money basically and keeps reliability higher at a lower price point.
So just on that, because that's a really good question, I think. Some folks would say that we haven't kept up with production, right? We've taken plants offline, we've taken different types of fuel sources maybe offline, but is it a question of that, or is it a question of distribution system, wires, poles, distribution, or is it a little bit of everything?
It's more the latter. Like a battery can help with an aging distribution system or one that's stretched thinner by more demands. It can't help with the actual gross quantity of electrons we're using up on the grid. And you're right, there have been more retirements of generation plants than we have been able to keep up with new generation. And batteries can only store electrons that are generated. And right now, there aren't a lot of extra electrons on the grid. All the renewable energy we're really generating to date right now in New York City is used in the instant that it gets generated, even at night. We think of demand being higher during the day and lower at night, but even during the nighttime, we're using up every clean electron we've got.
Yeah, it's a complex issue, and it's not certainly a inexpensive one either, right? So to upgrade the system is a massive, massive investment. I think that's what a lot of folks are seeing today also on their bills when they look at why are their bills so expensive. I think it's because there needs to be a significant amount of investment in the distribution system, which maybe hasn't taken place over the years like it should, or maybe the growth is just exploding at a time that, data centers. We haven't even talked about data centers coming in, and interesting to see what the state's going to do, or I should say the governor is going to do on that moratorium bill. But with data centers coming in, inevitably, there's going to have to be data centers coming in, and that's going to take up more energy as well.
I think what you laid out there about sort of deferred maintenance versus higher demands, that's definitely a both and. And I see that not just in the electricity sector, but in all kinds of civil infrastructure. That's bridges and roads, sewer lines. I mean, all the really unsexy stuff that we rely on and we don't want to fail. And yet, when it comes up to a vote, a lot of times that kind of thing that requires extra costs on people's bills, people say, not this year, maybe next year. And, if you think to yourself, well, is such and such system, is this bridge going to fall down this year? Probably not. Is it going to fall down next year? Probably not. But if you do a lot of probably nots year after year, you can't. And I think that is the larger thing we face as a society, is that all of our infrastructure is now aging out.
It's funny. We see that our members see that certainly. You brought up sewer for sure, water. A lot of the infrastructure there is so old, goes back to the 60s, maybe 50s, post war. And yeah, we can't get the state to really help us invest in those important infrastructure. And today, not to get off topic for a moment, but with the PFOAs and the lead pipes and all the things we have to go back and address, all of our infrastructure, energy and water and is just at a point where it needs major, major investment. And so,
Yeah, and that's what the hard part. When you're in the town's position, you would have to take a very unpopular stance to say we're going to, double your tax levy in the town of such and such in order to replace. And yet the state isn't coming up with money, and neither are the feds. And it's like, well, whose responsibility is this? And it's an
right.
open question. I don't come with the answer, but I do know that for every elected who has to make those hard choices, it's nothing's great, because you're either making an expensive choice or a pass the buck choice.
No question. Back in the 70s, the feds used to give 90 cents on the dollar for every water and sewer that line you put in. So they don't do that. They don't do that anymore. So,
Mm-hmm.
getting back to the battery storage, because that's the relevant topic for us, is a lot of concerns,
Mhm.
and you've heard and you've seen has been around potential fires
Mhm.
burning and this type of stuff. We saw one in Warwick just recently, not too long ago, I think this year, maybe early, late last year. But new fire codes, I believe, came out in January. Can you just talk about how that impacts, these storage facilities?
Yeah, so taking one step further back in history, I think it was maybe 3 summers ago, there were three battery storage fires in New
Mhm.
York, and in relatively quick succession. And so the state put together a task force across a whole number of agencies saying, what's going on here? Because in theory, storage is a goal of our state, but we can't be having this. And so the root cause analysis was done. They came up with they did a bunch of testing on all these sites. They figured out what had gone wrong in those instances, and they updated the battery codes to take the lessons learned from that. And it's, some of what the codes look for and the updated batteries are trying to do is not catch fire as much. Now you remember that a few years ago there was a line of cell phones that were catching fire. And there was a big recall on that because cell phones cannot be catching fire. We do not accept that as a risk we want to live with. These things sit in our pockets every day. And so by sort of quality standards, cell phones were engineered away from having a fire risk with their batteries. They're lithium ion, same as these storage batteries we're talking about on the grid. And it was a question of design standards and holding phone manufacturers to task. And so the same thing is what's happening now on this grid scale battery. It's saying they can catch fire or not, but we need to have them not catch fire. And in the circumstance that they would catch fire, we need to have very strict rules about what happens and who does what. And that's what the new codes came about. And so for the fire that you mentioned in Warwick, that was actually a complete success from a codes and firefighting perspective, because although it caught fire, it didn't spread. There was no harm to any people. There was no pollution that came out of it. And it put itself out in its own course of time. And it had been built to the new codes and it worked, if you will. So even though it did catch fire, it was a success on all the fronts that firefighters would want.
So let's build off of that for a moment, because one of the things we get a lot of is folks worried about the pollutants or the air quality after a fire or during a fire. It's been alleged that it puts off a lot of different toxins into the air, but you're saying no, it doesn't.
Well, no different than any house fire.
Yeah.
So yes, I mean all
Okay.
smoke has toxins in it, and any house that goes up in flames, you're burning plastic stuff and couches and flooring and all that nasty stuff. I mean, no one wants their house
Yeah.
to go up in flames either, and you shouldn't breathe the smoke. But it is not any worse or different or more concentrated than a house fire.
That's interesting.
And
That's
so,
that's a good
yeah, so
point.
you'd think because you're like, oh, well, there's batteries, there's got to be more toxic stuff in there, but in truth, there isn't. That was part of what the study figured out. So when they've done all these monitoring at these different handful of fire events, they're like, oh, this is normal house fire smoke. So yeah, you shouldn't breathe it in, but you don't have to do a giant evacuation either.
Right. Interesting. So, I mean, there's been gas station fires, right? Those have put off
Right.
some toxins into
Right.
the.
Sure, that's full of toxins. Right. When I've been on the throughway when an oil tanker has caught fire, shortly in front of me, and that didn't look great to breathe either. But that's sort of an accepted risk that we as a society have decided we're okay with because
Right.
we need to get our, fuel in our cars. So okay, every now and then a tanker will overturn, and that is too bad, but it's also not the end of the world. It doesn't mean we don't use cars because tankers might turn over.
So you mentioned this risk a couple times, taking the risk, right? And deciding when to take the risk, which is interesting to me because it is a question maybe of what would you say to a town that says, why would we take the risk in our community? What is it about what is this? First of all, is it a bad risk? Is a huge risk? And number two, why would a town want to take that on?
So I think what you're identifying there is both degree of risk and frequency, if you will, of a potential event and badness of a potential event. So for example, if your town is growing and you're getting more houses, you're going to have more house fires because you have more houses, so that's just going to happen. But does that mean we don't want to have more people in our towns? If we have a growth plan for the town, we want more people, it'll put kids in the school kind of thing. So we say, well, occasional house fires, well, that's why we have fire tax to pay the fire people to show up and put it out. So in this instance, I would say that batteries are analogous to houses. They are not more likely to catch fire than your average house, and they are not riskier when they do. Nothing more bad will happen to your town than having one more house built there. I think it seems scary because it's a different technology, but the actual physical risk to the town, its inhabitants, and to pollution is no different. And from a firefighting perspective, one of the things that's very clear in the new codes is that the fire safety personnel should not be spraying anything on the darn thing. The fire personnel's only job is to keep people back so that the public themselves don't get in a bad spot and to prevent any other structure from catching fire. But there's no spraying, there's no water, because there's not enough water in any town to spray. It doesn't help. And you don't want water polluting, and running off. That would be a problem. So you just stand back and let it burn because there's nothing to save.
Right. And typically it takes, I mean, there's no standard size, so I don't know, but Warwick, I think was days, right?
Yeah, I think it was days, but it was like mostly days of a very low level sort of smoldering as it went itself out because again, they didn't want to put it out. If it were a house fire, folks would have been standing there with water until there was no smoke left. And
Right.
it's just not how that works in this instance.
Right. Which is interesting. I think that there seems to be so many concerns around fires and toxicity and that. Where do you suppose, is it just just bad information out? I mean, is there any relevance to what folks are saying? Because I seem to hear it a lot. Or is it just bad information that continues to get tossed around?
That is my sense, and I think that because it seems newfangled, it is a little more alarming than if we were saying, hey, I'm going to, put a shoe factory in your town. Well, that could also catch fire, but, shoe factory doesn't sound too newfangled, so we're not going to worry too much about it. I also think that I'm not that much online, so I have trouble putting words to it, but I think that there is a viralness to how information spreads online and the way that it can move about without getting fact checked, and I think that there's the ability also for people online to not allow different perspectives on their page. So if you disagree with so-and-so, they'll just kick you off their page. And so their entire page is a page of one perspective and not a balanced perspective.
Well, that is certainly social media in a nutshell right there, right? The echo chamber. We all hear, or folks hear what they want to hear, and very interesting. But we
There's
are
one thing
talking.
you asked actually, and I didn't answer, and I'm sorry, Chris, about why a town would want such a thing. And I think it's the same as any economic development project. It's what is you, developer, going to do for me in the town? What kind of pilot agreement are we going to get? What host community agreement is going to get? And what else benefit might it provide? Is it going to help town reliability if there's a blackout on the larger grid? Is it going to help keep the fire station lit when nothing else is operating? Those are the kinds of questions. Those would be the things that would get a town to guess. It's not anything else.
Are you seeing, you must be hearing that it's been kind of difficult to get these cited. You see a lot of moratoriums being passed. Would you say, what do you see the future of getting these things permitted and built within towns then, if there's been such a pushback on them? Do you see a path forward?
Yeah, I do see a path forward, and I think it's answering people's concerns legitimately and straightforwardly and with facts and with respect. If people have, I think this is true with a lot of renewable energy projects. There are some people who have concerns that are specific and addressable, and some people who just don't want it in their town. And I think that those are different things. If you bring a specific and addressable concern, then let's roll up our sleeves together and figure out how to address whether it's a fire concern or a grid concern or how do we service this safely with our fire personnel or whatever that is. Let's have a conversation. I'm sure that can be worked out if it's rational heads actually trying to problem solve. It's when it's not that it's sort of like, well, we're talking in circles past one another, but that's different. But I think the benefits of these projects, I think will start to convince towns that it's worth having. I mean, there are a handful of towns that have operating battery storage in them, and some of them have had for a number of years, and they seem perfectly happy with the facilities in their towns. The lived experience is different than what people fear. I think it's also similar like when wind turbines were first proposed in New York State, a lot of places were against them, but some towns put them up. And 20 years later, they've generally said, yeah, this has been a great thing for our towns, put a pile of money into our coffers and our schools. We'd do it again if we had to do it again.
It's funny. We've talked about this probably back when we were on that panel. One of the things I notice with towns very often is when the state tries to shove things down local government's throat, there becomes a backlash to that, right? So I've often told the governor's office and legislators, look, go out and try to work with folks that want to work with you. Go out and try to put success out there and let that be your way in. And I don't know if they necessarily have really taken that advice or not, but I think you are saying the same thing I'm saying is let's get in consultation. Let's get all the facts on the table. Let's have a conversation and respect the fact of where folks are coming from. And I think that's probably, I agree with you 100%. I think that's the way forward on a lot of things, not just battery
Not
storage.
just this. Yeah, exactly right.
So we're talking with Marguerite Wells from ACE, New York. We're talking about battery storage. We started this conversation talking about really why the state needs battery storage facilities. And so, just interested to get your thoughts on where we're going, because you're way more of an expert in this subject area than I am, where we're going with energy. I'm going to say policy for lack of a better word, but where are we going with renewables? Where are we going with battery? Where are we going? How are we going to meet the demands of the future? What do you see in the state of New York in the next 5, 10, 15 years?
Well, writ large, I think I see lots more demand for energy. I mean, even if data centers were not the hot topic today, I think that would still be true. I think we're still adding manufacturing. I think we're still adding a lot more electricity to our daily lives and expectations. Data centers only make it more so. And, I think it's an open question how many of those turn up, how real they are, and on what schedule. But even aside from them, we've got to build a whole lot more energy. The point you made a few minutes ago that retirements have gone faster than new facilities have been built. That is true. And we've got to build a whole lot of new facilities. And they, whether they're renewable energy, they're nuclear, they're anything else you might propose, none of it's quick and all of it's none of it's cheap. I'll say that. They're differing levels of expensive and differing levels of quick. I mean, right now, renewable energy is relatively quick to get built because a lot of projects are already in the pipeline. They've done a lot of the studies. And when one says go, it's about a year or two before it's constructed and actually delivering electrons to the grid. That's quicker than you can do a gas turbine or a nuclear plant. But I think in 15 years, there's going to be a whole lot more different kinds of facilities trying to meet the need. And certainly the governor has strong goals for nuclear as well. And I don't think that's any easier to cite than renewable energy is.
No, I don't think it is. I don't think a lot of energy is easy to cite, actually,
It's not.
energy production facilities, but
I mean, it's like so much infrastructure. People want it. They want to live with the benefits of it. They just don't want to see it. And energy is just, one hot topic today. But, do I want you tearing up my road to update the sewer system? Well, no, not really. But I still want to flush my toilet.
right, right. The end of the day. So you've been talking a little bit about technology. Lithium battery is certainly kind of a newer technology. You talk about newfangled things. Is there anything in the battery space, because this has been brought up before, that would suggest there's other technology that can be used in this place other than lithium? I don't have the different technology in my brain right now. What other battery options and why haven't they been used, or do they even exist?
Yeah, so that's kind of a wide open space. There's a ton of other technologies. So lithium ions, what we're familiar with because it's in all our cell phones and our cordless drills, and it is certainly the most commonly used on the grid today. Why is that? Because it's cheap, it's financeable, you can get it, you can order it today and have it tomorrow. Its characteristics are well known. It's very quick responding. It responds in milliseconds when it's doing stuff on the grid. And so it's very helpful as a shock absorber on the grid because, if there's some variation in voltage because, a tree gets struck with lightning and it hits a pole, and all of a sudden the grid is a little bit wobbly for a second, battery storage can fill that wobble right in and keep things stable. And that's a really helpful function. I mean, there's an entire slice of how the energy markets work that is just that. It's millisecond balancing of the grid. So that's on the good side of the ledger. Obviously, the challenge we face is this question about flammability. Is it safe? Is there something that would be safer? And the answer is yes and no. There's stuff that there are there's all kinds of other chemistries. There's sodium batteries and vanadium batteries and flow batteries and thermal batteries and physical batteries. There's batteries where you basically lift up a concrete block and then you lower it when you want the energy back. And there's ones that are compressed air. You compress air into a container and then you let the air back out like a giant balloon. All of these things work. And there are, there's either demonstration projects or commercial projects elsewhere in the world doing all of these things. And the question is, how much room do they take up? How much energy can they dispatch and store? And what are their pros and cons? Everything has pros and cons. And so just because it's not made of lithium doesn't necessarily mean that it's in a sort of life cycle perspective. You'd have to evaluate all of its pros and cons. And also the availability. A lot of them are very niche and very new. And so you just can't get you can't get a loan and go buy, a new such and such facility because there's only one in the world and it's, in year 2 of operation. So it's sort of like, well, let's wait and see if this thing works. And at the end of the day, that means that a lot of those things are more expensive on a unit energy basis.
I think that's what it comes down to, definitely.
It does.
What's more efficient to utilize. Just because, we're in Albany here and I think of Plug Power a lot, I always wonder why hydrogen is not more in the mix in the conversation, but I don't know, that might be a different conversation.
No, it's very much the same conversation, actually. And hydrogen is very interesting. Hydrogen has had many sort of booms and busts of popularity over the years. About 5 years ago, it was in boom phase. Right now, I think it's in quiet phase. Yeah. I think, like any other technology, it is very good at certain things and not as good at other things. And so, for example, what Plug Power does, I think they run forklifts and they run fuel cells on green hydrogen. And that's a great use case where you have enclosed places, you really want no emissions. And in the same way that a propane forklift is better than a gasoline forklift because you don't want to gas your operators in an enclosed environment, clean hydrogen is even better. The challenge is, again, you need electricity to generate the hydrogen. You can't just sort of bring it out of thin air. And so that brings it back to where are we getting that electricity from? Now, even if you were burning coal to turn it into hydrogen, that's one way of doing it. I don't know the life cycle emissions of that versus making hydrogen from some clean energy source like hydropower or wind or whatever, but there's no free lunch. And storing hydrogen is very hard and moving it is hard. If you put it in a pipeline, which is the cheapest way to move anything, I mean, obviously that's why we move natural gas in pipelines because it works really well. But the hydrogen molecule is a lot smaller than the methane molecule that is natural gas. And so it leaks out of tinier holes all the time. So you can't use a regular pipeline to move hydrogen. You have to have a special pipeline made special ways. It's like, well, okay, that's not going to be cheap. If you want to store it in volumes, it takes up a lot of room. So again, I wish hydrogen was going to be a bigger part of the mix. I think it will always serve a niche part of the mix, but I don't think it's any panacea.
Yep. So tell me a little bit about what you have on your plate over at your association, ACE New York. What's on your minds and what are you guys working on?
Well, I think one thing that we're working on that's relevant to this conversation is the public interest and acceptance of renewable energy writ large, not just battery storage, but wind and solar projects as well. Because I think they have become more politicized than they were, say, 5 years ago. I think it was easier, regardless of one's political persuasion, to be interested in locally generated energy from solar panels and wind turbines. And now it's harder. It's more politicized. And so that makes it harder to get to yes, even if you'd like to, as a local constituent. I've talked to farmers who have said, yeah, I'd love to have this project on my farm. It would be incredibly helpful to my farm incomes, but I can't talk to my neighbors about it. I think they're going to be against it, and I can't do something my neighbors hate me for. I mean, that's sort of that kind of community relationship is so important to people in communities that are close-knit, that have good relationships with one another, that what your neighbors think of what you do actually matters very much in one's own decision-making, and that just makes it hard. And it's a shame that it's politicized because it doesn't need to be. A farmer should be able to make their own decisions about what they want to do with their land and what works for their family. And that's challenging. And I think there's a lot of misinformation coming in from social media about this and that, and it sounds frightening. And I think it's more easy to spread fear online and anger online than it is to spread warmth or facts or kindness or support. So I think the places that are loud and angry are bubbling with energy, and the places that are supportive and kind are not as energized or populated. And that's tough because I think the majority of people, if you look at polling, the majority of people do support clean energy projects, especially if their community were to benefit from them. But I think that's a tough public position to take, and that's a shame.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I've always loved your openness and frankness, and the two associations here have always worked well together, even though we may not be on the same side of policy very often. But I think there's a model here of how we can talk through things and try to see each other's points of view. And I think we have reasonable expectations on each other's constituencies. And I really have always appreciated that. And I think we're going to have to continue working together to try to get this problem solved.
No, I completely agree. Because I think that the more polarized we get, the less we actually hear one another and the less we can get done.
So you can totally refuse to answer this question, but what's your take on the governor signing the data center moratorium bill? Or maybe,
I have no insight as to whether or not she will. I have no inside track, whatever. Whether she should or not, I think depends on where one stands. I am sort of agnostic on it, honestly, because I think there's good parts to it that say that the clean energy projects that the data centers need to bring clean energy with them. I think there's some language in there that is pretty weak that doesn't indicate that it needs to be in state. And so one could ostensibly buy clean energy from Texas and have it count. I think that would be an economic loss for New York for it not to be New York projects. And I'm not sure whether it would actually slow the way it's worded, I'm not sure it would slow any projects down or not.
interesting. Yeah, I have no insight on it either. And I only know that our members are interested to some extent because, of course, they're concerned about land use as well. So we'll see.
Yeah.
Probably be
It's not an
something.
easy thing to crack no matter how, because you don't want to push away economic development that one given town might actually want. On the other hand, I understand very much speaking of fear, there's a lot of discussion of fear around battery storage or renewable energy writ large. Well, data centers make it 10 times worse. They have more backlash and more people worked up for all different kinds of reasons.
Yeah.
And it doesn't, again, puts a town in a hard position because towns have multiple interests to balance. They have their voters, but then they also have the town's own economic needs. You got to keep the lights on and keep the sewer lines updated. And if there's no tax dollars to do that with, then how are you going to keep the toilets flushing?
Yeah, see, I think you bring up a good point because we've talked about this before with others. Oh, why don't we do a standardization or, have the state come out with setbacks or size restrictions or whatever. And I've always pushed back on that, saying that every community is different. What's good for one community may not be good for, we've said those times, Long Island, upstate, Western New York, Southern Tier.
Right.
It's so different, and it's so different within the towns that it's best to let them decide on those types of things. So I do not want to see us push in that direction, although some people have suggested we should, as they think that's the answer. I don't think that helps at all as far as land use is concerned, but no easy answers here, Marguerite.
Well,
No
I
easy
do
answers.
think on data centers that there can be more creativity. I think we're in the early stages of them being a thing. And so we all sort of in the collective imagination, we picture a giant box that uses a lot of energy that sits out in a field somewhere. And there's no people, there's no jobs, it just sits there and hums. And the question is, does it pay enough into the local coffers to be worth its while or not? I think there is potential going forward to reimagine them more dynamically and sort of like, what else could you do for my community? Like, if you have all this waste heat and hot water, could we use that to put hot water piping into our towns? Or maybe we have like an indoor water park in every town that has a data center because there's a lot of hot water. Like, I don't know, but if you started thinking about it that way, to say, what can we do with a giant building and a lot of hot water and whatever other resources it brings to bear, then maybe we can turn the whole narrative around and say, I want this in my town because it actually does things for my town that I'm not getting currently. And it's not just a downside, it's also let's think about how we make it an upside that we want.
Right. A lot of projects bring community benefits in, and that's a great way to approach a town. We're getting towards our end. Is there anything that we did not talk about that you want to bring up, or anything you do want to talk about? I want to make sure I don't miss anything on this important topic.
No, I think you've covered a lot of the main topics. I think from a town's perspective, what I always encourage folks is to think about it not so much, and in all of these different energy types and data centers too, is how to make it a negotiation so that the town gets things that it wants and needs that it otherwise isn't going to get. Because then you have a negotiating position to work with these companies and say, here's what we actually need. What can you do from this shopping list of stuff? And they can't do it all for sure, but they can do some things. And if it starts to feel more balanced, then I think it puts the town in a stronger position.
Yeah, that's I think some great advice, and something we've always often talked about and kind of advised our members to do. Make sure you're talking and negotiating and trying to get the best for your community out of this. So
Right.
for sure, it's a topic that's not going away as we continue into the 90s. This next week or so, we'll probably see more strain on the grid. So we'll keep talking about it, and we'll keep trying to work towards solutions, Marguerite. But
Well,
I
thank
want
you
to
so much.
thank you for joining us. Anytime you want to come back, let us know. Anything you want to talk about, it'll be great. You're very interesting, and always learn something, very knowledgeable. So that's always a positive. So thank you so much for being here. And folks, I just want to remind you again, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, like, share, and subscribe. And we'll be back a couple weeks with another Talk of the Towns. Thank you.